I'd like to direct this question to Messrs. Lennon and McCartney. In a recent article, Time magazine put down pop music, and they referred to Day Tripper as being about a prostitute, and Norwegian Wood as being about a lesbian. Now, I just wanted to know what your intent was when you wrote it, and what your feeling is about the Time magazine criticism of the music that is being written today.
We were just trying to write songs about prostitutes and lesbians, that's all.
First sight, the Nems Enterprises, Brian Epstein's management company, did appear to be, I can't say amateur because everyone was working very hard there, but lacking a little in organization. But as I say, everyone was very enthusiastic, which made up for it really. And I don't believe that any great errors were made in promotion, contractual relationships and so on. No, it worked very well. It worked very well. Although, as I say, there was no great definition of people's roles there. Brian invited me to become, as he termed it, Chief Administrative Executive, a title which I never used at all. But subsequently, he made me director of the company. Brian was a very hands-on manager. He was their greatest fan. He had their interests at heart in every conceivable respect.
Very, very proper Englishman, kind of Englishman I'd see in English movies. Spoke the language beautifully, dressed beautifully, and a gentleman. We never had a contract. Each time our contracts were done over the phone. I bought them without having seen them. And he told me I was the first American to call him. And I offered him something that he couldn't resist. Carnegie Hall. He says, I've heard about Carnegie. The Beatles were not known in America at that time. Not even their records were playing. But I'd been reading about them.
Their success in the States wasn't immediate. I mean, their singles had been released in the States before to very little impact. I mean, roughly sort of impact of, feather on concrete, I suppose. But I Want to Hold Your Hand somehow caught the mood of the hour, caught the lightning.
I said, bring them here. They were becoming stars not just in Liverpool, but going across the country and then doing Germany. And going on to France later on. I bought them because the language was the same, and kids of England, Germany, France were responding to their music. But when I saw them, that very first time, when I presented them at Carnegie Hall, and I met them before they went on, at their hotel, at the Plaza Hotel, looking out the window of the Plaza Hotel and seeing hundreds of kids waving to them from downstairs below the Plaza Hotel and singing their songs.
In some ways, the Beatles had already cracked America before they even arrived there, because they'd already got to #1 with I Want to Hold Your Hand. And then there was the airport arrival, where there was another big PR campaign, and I think Capitol Records paid lots of fans to go and sort of jump up and down.
And for a lot of people, they equate the early Beatles with I Want to Hold Your Hand, especially in North America. That song really defines an era.
It was actually quite a lot slower. It was almost like a ballad when they wrote it, and George Martin lifted the tempo. And that's what made it click straight away.
It's just a very cool, simple subject matter, which was very well done in the great Beatles way, with great melodies, great middle eights, just very well put together.
John Lennon plays what would be considered almost as prehistoric heavy metal, kind of a rhythm guitar track. Very aggressive.
It's got a really strong melody against the chords, and that's why I think a song like that stands the test of time, because of the power of the melody.
It may have been a simple song, but the way it was performed and the combination of the two, plus of course the visuals, remember that television was beginning to come into its own then, that really the Beatles made each and every song of theirs their own.
The vocals explode into almost an orgasmic kind of a finale.
I want to hold your... That's quite an ecstatic leap. They may not have been thinking of the word hand.
What I Want to Hold Your Hand has is energy and vitality and self-confidence, and whoop, we're taking on the world and we're going to beat everybody. Doesn't matter what the words say, and lots of people have gone back since and said, oh, the Stones wanted to take you to bed, the Beatles just wanted to hold your hand. And okay, that's true on one level, but let's just listen to the actual sort of impact of the song. The words are meaningless. What the song is saying is, we're going to take on the world, we're going to win.
I think I Want to Hold Your Hand is iconic. That is the Beatles number that became the biggest in America. This is what started them in America, you know. And this is the record that they were first told when they were in Paris, you've just come #1 in the American charts. And the whole of America fell in love with them, you know, and it was such an upbeat, happy song. Just a couple of months after President Kennedy had been assassinated and America had been in mourning, and suddenly they had something to smile about with the Beatles and this particular number. And I think it is iconic, will always be remembered, and I think with Americans they'll always think of that particular number.
Ed Sullivan. Ed Sullivan had been traveling across Europe to get to Heathrow Airport and take a plane back to his native New York. At the airport, when he got to Heathrow, he saw a bunch of kids holding up signs. Now the Beatles were not known here. And he saw posters. We love John, we love Ringo, we love Paul, we love George. Welcome home, Ed Sullivan. Asked an airport attendant, who are these Beatles? Ed Sullivan used to present a lot of the animal acts. You're too young to remember that, I think. He asked an airport attendant, is this an animal act? And the man said, no, this is England's most popular singing group. He had someone in his office check out, who are these Beatles? And he learned that a New York promoter with my name was presenting them. The secretary called me and said, Mr. Sullivan asked me to call you and told me that he found out that you were bringing the Beatles over. Is that correct, Mr. Burns? I said, yes. What do you think of them? I said, they're a phenomenon. The rest was history. They came here, they did the Sullivan show. Sullivan bought them 3 days prior to my date. Historically, his show was on a Sunday. Mine happened to be on a Wednesday, February 12th. He put them on Sunday, February 9th.
The Ed Sullivan Show was the sort of North American equivalent of Sunday night at the London Palladium, in that it was transmitted coast to coast and everybody saw it. And it had roughly the same effect on the American public as the Beatles' appearance at, on Sunday night at the London Palladium had a few months earlier, in that everybody was glued to the TV. And a significant statistic here is that while the Beatles were on, not a single hubcap was stolen in the whole of New York.
The Ed Sullivan shows was extremely important.
It was a big deal.
They saw how an American TV show worked. The whole of America saw the Beatles.
So as a springboard for America, it was huge.
By just having one or two performances for him, they could basically cover the whole of America coast to coast.
You know, you hear stats like the juvenile delinquent crime rate dropped that night because everyone was at home watching it on television. You know, just like everyone who was alive in that era could tell you where they were when they heard Kennedy died, most people will tell you that they saw the Beatles that night in February.
To appear on the Ed Sullivan Show was like the music business seal of approval.
When you were on Ed Sullivan, you were a star, and I think to us young kids at the time, it solidified the fact that these guys are mega stars and they're here to stay.
I think it was very sort of careful, clever management that got the Beatles to where they are, but the Ed Sullivan shows were crucial in their career development.
It was crucial, really. I don't know if you could say they were being marketed. I think they were just being unveiled, really. I prefer that this phenomenon of the Beatles. The Americans just love the group.
But you can't, it's impossible to overstate the importance of the Ed Sullivan shows, because I think it was 73 million people watched them. Something like 1 in 3 of the American population watched the Beatles, and that would have been an awful lot of kids, obviously, but also parents who were actually seeing this group for the first time.
There are two strands here. I think the American image of English people at that time was the bowler hats and the umbrella type of guy, you know? So suddenly these guys come along here, and we're clipped, and they also had the idea that people had clipped English, you know, very well-spoken people, probably like Brian Epstein. And these 4 guys come off a plane, you know, or whatever, with their mop-top heads, which these days doesn't seem outrageous, as it doesn't seem that long, but it was then, with their different accent, with the Liverpool accent. They really encountered that before, and cracking jokes, you know, sort of stuff, doing one-off comments. So I think the Americans were just blown over by it and fascinated by it.
The Ed Sullivan shows introduced the Beatles to an awful lot of people who had no idea what was #1 in the pop charts. And it also marked the point where they grew beyond being a teenage band and actually became a sort of worldwide, universal, all-age band.
Because they had been used, really, apart from, I mean, they had people like Bill Haley, Rock Around the Clock, but he was then a guy of 30, which was quite old for teenagers, and he had his Kiss Curl, and there was Elvis, but Elvis had gone in the army, and he was a fairly clean-cut sort of guy, wasn't he? But then these guys come along, the Beatles.
One of the great myths about 60s pop is that nothing was happening in America and the Beatles came along and revolutionised everything. It's just not true. The 2 biggest groups in America in 63, 64 were the Beach Boys and the Four Seasons, and they were pushing each other all the time to do more and more innovative songs and innovative records. Meanwhile, you've got Phil Spector making some of the greatest records of all time. And there were some wonderful country things coming out of Nashville. Soul music was kicking off. You've got Sam Cooke, Otis Redding just starting out, Ray Charles in his prime. It was anything but a desert. But what the Beatles did was bring an entirely new sort of atmosphere of freshness and Englishness, which hadn't been seen on the American pop scene before.
The cracking of America was achieved with contributions from a number of different sources. And, I mean, on the part of Capitol Records, there was also undoubtedly unusual promotional expenditure in their way. They were prepared to sort of spend money. They produced all kinds of gimmicky things like Beatles wigs. They had their executives going around the place in Beatles wigs and waving flags and posters and so forth. And they certainly provided posters and banners for the kids to wave at the airport at New York when the Beatles first arrived in February '64. Yeah, they did. So it's a concentrated effort from all aspects, but it was all directed at different parts of the market, and that's what was crucial. Normally, a rock and roll campaign would have concentrated purely on the teeny bop magazines probably. We concentrated on the widest possible range, from the most sophisticated magazines and newspapers across the board down to the teeny bop fanzines.
First of all, it was made at a much more leisurely pace than Please Please Me had been. So they had a chance to have a breath and actually take a break after doing 2 or 3 songs rather than trying to do them all in one day. And secondly, they were allowed to double track, overdub for the first time, and so they could actually overdub their vocals, put the same vocal on twice just to sort of make the sound thicker. In fact, I think later on, I think it was John who said that they more or less double-tracked themselves off that record because having discovered they could do it, it was a great game. They just wanted to do it on every track. But there's some fantastic material on that record. There's songs like All My Loving, It Won't Be Long, which are easily as good as their singles, and also some of their very, very best cover versions, particularly Smokey Robinson's song, You've Really Got a Hold on Me, which I think is one of the very, very few white versions of a Motown song that actually beats the original.
All My Loving, for me, is one of the great unsung heroes of the Beatles era, the early era. It's such an unbelievably great song.
When All My Loving came out, it was on their second album in England with the Beatles, and by the time they came over to North America, that song was one of the first songs I think they opened up with The Sullivan Show.
It was a key song in the Beatles' career. It was just the right balance between kind of schmoozy romanticism and kind of professional, quite hard-driving rock band.
And there's a sense in which they're taking further what they have done previously, because instead of basically 4 chord loops, which is what we'd had up to this point, you have a much longer pattern. Gosh, it sounds like organ music like that, doesn't it? But that's what they're doing. That's the underlying pattern. You have an 8 chord sequence. They finish with that. Now, we happen to be in E major at this point. That chord belongs. That chord is borrowed from a sort of a blues background.
All My Loving was the very first song that Paul wrote where the words came before the music. He said he wrote it like a poem, and then the music came sort of later. So this was another step in the songwriting experience of him.
This is about where they started losing some of the high end in their sound, in my opinion. You won't hear that cymbal crash and the snare quite as much. You're starting to hear a little bit more of the bottom end of the song, a little bit more bass. Bass is a little more predominant in that song, in the drums as well as the actual bass playing.
Paul had this walking bass line that was unheard of before. There's so many chords in it, and he just had this beautiful walking bass line all the way through. And it was kind of overshadowed even by John's jangly rhythm guitar, which is very, very hard to execute on stage or studio or anything.
And Lennon always said that he had a hard time playing that song because of the complicated sort of fretting pattern on that song. So definitely it was a step up. The Beatles were experimenting more. They were doing something that was different. They weren't copying so much as developing and innovating.
What we have here is a song I think that's fairly well advanced, certainly compared with their first compositions on the first album.
To this day, I can't believe that a song's so good that it would never have used it as a single. But that's certainly my all-time favorite Beatles song. I can listen to that thing forever.
I think All My Loving is an interesting bit of songwriting from Paul. First of all, because of the counterpoint or harmony singing, which is, I think, the most interesting that the Beatles have done up to that point. Secondly, because it's got some amazing rhythm guitar work on it from John, which I think he was very, very proud of. And thirdly, because it's maybe Paul McCartney's first great melody, which it's on the road to things like Yesterday and so on later on. Now, I remember being told by a friend of mine that it's actually nicked from Tchaikovsky. I don't know whether that's true or not. I've never heard the bit of Tchaikovsky, but it's just a fantastically catchy pop song, and it says something about the calibre of the Beatles' material at that point, that they could write a song as amazingly commercial as that and then not put it out as a single.
By then they could have easily written the whole album, but I think obviously because again they're a new band still, even though they were knocking out number ones like anybody's business, they still obviously had people around them still didn't trust them to write a whole album full of their own material, which I think is a bit sad because I think they could have.
It's certainly not true that the Beatles were the first people to write their own hit records. The Shadows had done it. Even Cliff Richard had actually helped out the Shadows on to write some of his own hits. And in America, people like Chuck Berry had made an amazing career out of writing some of the greatest rock and roll songs of all time. But in terms of being an entirely sort of self-contained group who could come up with an entire album's worth of material, the Beatles were the first. And in some ways, you could say that they ruined the music industry because they made everybody else think, oh, if I'm going to be a proper pop star, I've got to write my own songs. And actually, an awful lot of pop stars have been far better having songs written for them by Carole King or people like that, but they insisted on doing their own. So it was a revolution which obviously encouraged the Beatles to come up with the best music they ever did, but at the same time also produced an awful lot of rubbish.
You couldn't yet get away with an album of entirely self-penned material, so you actually had to put in some standards in there. Things like Money and Roll Over Beethoven work well because they're the sort of rock and roll stuff that the Beatles have been playing for years. They're very familiar with that sort of style, and they're beginning to turn out things in their own style.
A lot of these American influences were very much a big draw on the Beatles. They really wanted to put a lot of these songs into their repertoire. And I think at the time, when that album came out, they were still unsure that their songs on their own could sell an album. So you throw a bunch of different covers on there too, because the average record buyer will go, oh, I know that song, Money, and they'll buy the album maybe on that purpose.
It's a way of sort of cementing themselves within the tradition to take on a song like that, which may not belong really within their repertoire, but because it uses material that they themselves use elsewhere, it's a way of saying, you know, we're actually firmly within this. Gosh, you don't want to think about tradition really, do you, for early Beatles? But that really is what they're saying. You know, we're not doing anything outrageous.
I'm not sure whether I'd say it's an improvement to the Hard Day's Night album because it's entirely Lennon and McCartney compositions.
I actually think there's more consistency there because this is all their own material.
It was great to listen to an album that was all new. It wasn't covers where, oh yes, I've heard that song, great cover, but I've heard the song. And I think it was a landmark in that sense where you knew they were here to stay.
A Hard Day's Night was some sort of highlight of the early years because every track was written by Lennon and McCartney and they were all strong numbers. Also, they were quite unusual. I mean, for example, the final track, I'll Be Back, which wasn't in the film, the harmonies wander all over the place. I mean, and it doesn't seem to have a standard sort of verse-chorus pattern at all. And I think they were actually trying to extend the boundaries of the common pop song.
Hard Day's Night, what an amazing record. It's completely composed by Lennon McCartney, to begin with. One of the very few times that had been done by anybody in a rock group up to that point. And the maturity of the songwriting within the very sort of narrow pop I love you, you love me kind of format they were working. They very, very complex harmonies, interesting chord changes, just fantastically professional songwriting all the way through. I think in lots of ways the most interesting thing about that record is the fact that it's completely dominated by John. I think almost for the last time on any Beatles record he wrote more songs than Paul did. I think 13, 14 songs, and John wrote about 10 of them. An amazing sort of purple patch for him. And I think that really sort of sent a huge rocket up Paul's backside. And as a result, Paul dominated almost every album after that.
I mean, it certainly produced, you know, a modicum of hits, not by the Beatles, in you know, all sorts of cover versions, you know, of all sorts of all the songs on it. Every song was covered by another artist. I mean, and the Beatles themselves scored with A Hard Day's Night itself, which was #1 for weeks throughout the summer.
I mean, what a way to start an album. You know, this was still a world where you expected introductions, proper introductions to songs. And all you get is this dissonant chord which rings and actually suggests nothing about what's going to follow. I mean, incredible.
There's no way that you can't actually just hear the beginning of that song and know who it is and what it is. It's a brilliant song.
This was the start of bringing in the slightly tougher approach and then juxtaposing it with the slightly sugary, more sort of softer middle section.
There's a sort of bit of a sort of slight humour in there as well. It's not completely, sort of just Hard Day's Night, sort of play on words. So it's still got a little bit of the kind of sort of romantic Beatles sort of theme running through it, but it's kind of much more confident.
And it was a step forward in melody and the way the backing vocals were arranged. Very, very good song.
I don't know, there's something about, the art school training or whatever like that, and you sort of admire the fact that 3 seconds into this thing you're saying, well, what's going to happen next, and it's not like somebody going, oh, look at me, I'm wonderful, or anything. It's kind of right in your face. You know about this, don't you?
Just that one chord. I mean, how many other songs are there where you can just hear one chord and you know what it is? Very, very self-confident piece of songwriting from John Lennon. At the other extreme, If I Fell, which is a John Lennon ballad that everybody assumes must be Paul McCartney. But it's John, again, very, very fragile love ballad in the sort of early 60s girl group tradition. And then a third song from John called You Can't Do That, which is as close as the Beatles ever got to being an R&B band. He said he was trying to get that sort of Wilson Pickett feel. And he actually plays lead guitar on that, which adds to the sort of general roughness and rowdiness of the atmosphere. Alongside that, very, very smooth bits of songwriting like Things We Said Today, Paul McCartney, one of his finest melodies again. But almost every track on the record is a standout. It's very hard to find a weak moment.
I suppose the next big step for the Beatles was to go onto the screen. I mean, people had seen them on television, but everybody had wanted to really get closer to the Beatles and see them, hear them talking, find out what they were like.
It was the first harder rock movie that was made that was a success in the cinemas.
Hard Day's Night was a fantasised version of what the Beatles' life was like. It was just that constant being chased. It was never sitting down for a minute of peace and being bullied into doing things. Yes, bullied into doing things they didn't always want to do. They did have their limits of how much they would commercialise themselves.
They just blew everyone away. They just made the right film with the right director, with the right script, at the right time, using all the right material. They couldn't have done it better.
Because United Artists thought the Beatles would probably just be a flash in the pan, sort of, overnight success and then disappear, they decided to make the movie for a £150,000 budget and in black and white to save money. So I think, in fact, actually, Paul McCartney said that thank God they made it in black and white, because if it had been in colour, it would have been crap.
It could have been a disaster. It could have gone the wrong way. It could have proven to be inept and embarrassing, or perhaps just not at home in a film medium. But in fact, they turned out to be just as confident and self-possessed as they appeared on stage or in interviews.
A Hard Day's Night was more or less art imitating life, showing a beat group going around the country in a bus, being chased by fans and never having a moment's rest. So you could say that it wasn't exactly challenging to write the script for that one.
In fact, a lot of people think that it was all ad-libbed, but there was virtually no ad-libbing at all. It was all scripted, written by a scriptwriter, Alan Owen. But because they were sort of young and they'd never acted and they were a little bit nervous, each line has a maximum of 6 words in it.
It was the first pop film that actually gave the impression of being real life, and obviously it wasn't, because the Beatles didn't all go running off round playing fields just before gigs, and Ringo didn't storm off and in a terrible huff just when they were about to go on TV and so on. And okay, their characters were very cliched and they were sort of placed into the pigeonholes that they then had to occupy for the rest of the 60s. But it had an amazingly documentary feel about it, which was all down to Dick Lester, the director. It was his idea, I think, to try and get away from the cliched let's do the show here, kind of Hollywood musical style.
Obviously what the Beatles would do for the movie musical, which in a sense was what this now was, an updating of the musical tradition, that would obviously set a tone for other groups to follow and for what was to come later in the decade.
That's another first for the Beatles.
So you've got the blue third and you've got a melody which is falling all the time, and it's scalic. Those characteristics are all important. You get into the middle eight or the bridge, you've lost your blue third, you've lost the falling nature of the melody, it's now basically rising, and you've lost the scalic aspect, it's now basically an arpeggio.
Can't Buy Me Love was an interesting song because it was the first major Beatles song to feature one vocal rather than Lennon and McCartney together.
And of course, seeing the Beatles in the movie A Hard Day's Night, aping around in the giant field when that song was playing, you know, it had a real fun flavour to it.
But what's significant is that the guitar, the electric guitar, has really comes to the fore and is mixed louder and drives the track along.
It was much more sort of aggressive, not in a mad way, but there was a tougher sort of sound and a tougher record and slightly more guitar-y. And I think in that way it made slightly more impact.
The public responded really well. They really liked the kind of more driving, harder edge, because by now bands like the Stones were starting to not really give the Beatles so much competition, but they were dirtier and harder and more kind of rock and roll. And the Beatles already were sort of starting to take on this kind of goody-goody image, which I don't think they really liked.
And I think still at this stage, George Martin was just helping them to, you know, drop that chord there, guys, or, you know, that's good, repeat that. So he was giving them his arrangement ideas.
Listen to the production. You know, because there's not a simple thing, even in the earlier tracks, you know, there's bongos going away in the background. It's all about feel, getting the tempo right and getting the feel right, and then singing like birds over the top.
When you would go to a concert, whether it be a big band, a small group, or whatever, you would be sitting in the audience of the venue and you would hear a mixture of direct sound from the stage, but you would always get a mixture of the ambience of that room, the throwback from the walls of whatever. And I had this sound in my mind that I wanted to try to get through to that similar sort of sound as I could and put it on tape as I could. So what I did, I had a method of, I used to go down to the Beatles, they were set, I'd set them up in a certain way. We did have a company policy before I became really established as a sound engineer, which I was told to follow, and that was by the use of screens, screening everything. You put a mic in front of an amplifier, you'd screen it, so that ideally, when you opened up that fader on that mic, all you would hear would be that whatever, that guitar, and that would improve the separation, as it was called. I didn't like that at all, because being a jazz performer with my own group, I like being close to the group as possible. It affects your own playing, etc. And I thought this would apply to the Beatles too, because they'd done quite a bit in Hamburg anyway, without having to worry about separation, etc. So I brought this to bear when I started to record, not for Love Me Do, but once they were established with Please Please Me, I thought, right, this is where now I can now do what I like, because now I'm established as a, dare I say, hit engineer. And so I would go down and I said, right, you can set the levels you're happy with yourself, whatever levels you want to set, do so. Unlike in a lot of sessions with other engineers, they would, when they're mixing up in the console, they would perhaps ask for so-and-so and so-and-so, can you turn your volume down a bit, or all this sort of stuff. But I let them set whatever they were happy with, their sound there. And I would stand back at the back of the studio and listen, see if I could get this ambionic, as I call it, sound, a mixture of them and what was coming back from the studio. And then I would place my mics accordingly, sometimes a long way back, to get a mixture, as I thought, of this sound. Sometimes I had to use a little bit of the echo chamber on voice singing. Sometimes you use a bit of that. Other than that, it was just the sound that I got from direct and the ambient sound.
In retrospect, I would consider that George Martin was the fifth Beatle.
They could do something he couldn't do, and he could do something they couldn't do. Perfect marriage.
Without him, we wouldn't have had such great records at all.
And it's very hard to work out where production ends and arrangement begins, because with Can't Buy Me Love, for instance, when you hear that song, you hear the chorus comes first. In fact, when they played it to him, the chorus didn't come first. He said, well, put it up front, lads, that's where it belongs, that's where it'll hit home quickest. And if you like, if that was a production hint, an arrangement or whatever, it was something George Martin helped them out with that helped make the song.
He allowed an unknown band to record their own material. Major step, changed everything for everyone over the whole planet. He changed everything. From then on in, new bands with no track record, with nothing behind them, could record their own material. This has never been done before. He changed pop music forever.
He was able to write for strings, he was able to walk into an orchestra session and say, I want you to play this, I want you to play that, write it down, give it to the musicians and they could play it or play on the piano. And the Beatles respected him, and he respected them.
As time went on, perhaps they outgrew him, but certainly for the early to mid period, it was a large part of George Martin that went in with the Lennon and McCartney.
They learned a lot from George Martin, and he was at the right place at the right time, and thank God for that.
And I Love Her was a good example of not just sort of screaming, twist and shout. It was John and Paul and thinking about writing more mature, introspective material.
You know, here was a song that had a very different beat, you know. The Ringo had it, you know, the drumming in it was, you know, a very different style. And it was just basically Paul and the acoustic guitar. Very nice song.
Searching for a new way of communicating an idea, an old idea, and I Love Her. It's been around, love song's been around forever, but they always seem to find a new way to introduce it to the public that would grab you in some way and kind of go, hey, that's interesting.
Unbelievably, he manages to just avoid it sort of turning into ludicrous sort of soppiness. And I think a lot of that's down to the quality of his voice. He just had this sort of inbuilt knowledge to just be tender enough, but then to put the odd little bit of kind of angst in there as well.
Here was an indication of that they could switch from tough rock and roll to writing sweet ballads.
I think one of the standout tracks on the Hard Day's Night album is Things We Said, one of the few McCartney songs on the whole record. It's a very simple song, and I think that without it on the album would probably be a little bit, maybe too contemporary. You know, it was quite a departure from earlier Beatles material.
It's quite virtuosic. It uses a very common pattern, the cycle of fifths. It uses it there, but it uses a different one in the middle eight. Now that's quite virtuoso. You're actually shifting key and you're using the same pattern but a different portion of the pattern.
And as it turned out, it's a brilliant soundtrack to a good, you know, pretty good movie.
Hit songs before the Beatles were more or less Boy, Girl, Moon, June, something based on what a guy would buy his girlfriend or possibly vice versa. So when the Beatles took up their songwriting pens, it was obvious to carry on the tradition that they knew all about.
It is the Beatles locking into what everybody else was singing about, and presumably what their audiences wanted to listen to songs about.
It was to do with them speaking to their fans, and when you look back, I guess it was a bit repetitious, but at the time nobody noticed.
Him and John would actually sit down and they'd think, like, if I was a teenage girl, what would I want the Beatles to sort of, you know, say to me, kind of thing, or what would I want? And so they were really, really aware of that sort of thing, and they wanted to make songs where people, you know, especially that teen market would pick up on that, and especially the young girl market that would want them to think that, oh, this, you know, Paul wrote this song for me, kind of thing, you know, and, you know, this kind of idea. So I think originally that really drove them with their songwriting.
It's part of the Beatles, you know. It's without that, I think there would have been another great band, but I think that's the sort of the whole issue of love is what established them at the top in the first place. So they wisely kept that sort of theme running through their output.
Had they been singing about women and different things, or singing about, as opposed to girls, I think we probably would have missed the message, and I don't think they would have been nearly as big as they were. Years later, they began to write songs about, like, for instance, She's a Woman. That would be where I would think they suddenly, when we were all a little bit older then too, so it was probably their evolution along with us that made them continue on to be strong with that group of Beatlemaniacs, I guess.
She's a Woman tends to go back to that bareness. It's a very uncluttered sort of texture. The emphasis is very much on the voice and the melody because there's not really much else going on. And I see that as a positive, as a sort of retrenchment almost, because that will look ahead to things like Norwegian Wood, where they can approach a thinner texture in a positive way and realise perhaps that everybody doesn't have to play all the time. The other particularly striking thing about She's a Woman is the title, because up till this point they've been singing about little girls, and all of a sudden they're singing about a woman. Well, that says something, doesn't it?
I Feel Fine will always be remembered for the feedback front. Big mistake, very genius to leave it.
Now, there is some debate over, was it in fact the first song with feedback, and whether it was or not is up for debate, but it's the first one that I ever heard.
And it's a fun song. Again, the Beatles could deliver the goods. I Feel Fine, a Lennon song, She's a Woman, a McCartney song. A great combination. There's something for everybody there.
I think that the process of moving from songs which depend on their chord structures to songs which depend on riffs is missed. I mean, we never really focus on that moment of change, but it's a fundamental change, and it begins to happen in around 1965, 1966. So this is crucial.
We're now at the height of their touring period, so they didn't really probably have enough time to get into the studio to give the thing, you know, their full attention. Two standout tracks on me for this one is I'm a Loser with John and Paul. I think the harmonies on this are actually first class, and I think it's John's statement. This is John's song, although Paul is doing some good harmony on it as well. And the other one that stands out for me was a great influence on the Beatles in their early days was Buddy Holly. It was also a great favourite of mine, and they sing Words of Love. And because I'm a Buddy Holly fan as well as a Beatles fan, I'm very critical of people that do Buddy Holly songs. They don't do them as good as Buddy Holly, but this Words of Love stands up with Buddy Holly's version, Words of Love, by the Beatles. So it's a good album for me, although it has been criticised as their weakest one.
Beatles for Sale was the work of a group that was becoming tired. With the previous album, A Hard Day's Night, it was every track was a Lennon-McCartney original. By the time Beatles for Sale came around, they'd fallen back very much on their old sort of Hamburg and Liverpool repertoire, you know, old-time rock and roll. Although there were some classic songs on it, like, you know, 8 Days a Week or I'm a Loser. But I think, you know, that was almost as if they were stepping back, you know, retreating to a prepared position almost before, you know, going once again for the jugular with the next album, Rubber Soul. But that isn't to say that it's a bad album. It's nothing, you know, you can't dismiss it as some sort of holding operation. I think it's a very strong album. But I mean, they look tired on the cover. And I think that, you know, it's to do with this sort of relentless touring schedule that had been, you know, unbroken since the beginning of 1963. And their recording sessions tended to be whenever they were available. It wasn't a case of block bookings. It was a case of, you know, whenever they could get to London.
If you look at the cover of Beatles for Sale, you've got 4 Beatles who look very tired and very bored, and that's the predominant feeling you get from the record. After the creative breakthrough of writing all the songs on A Hard Day's Night, it went back to the old routine of doing half their own songs, half other people's songs, and the covers sound so lame, with the exception of Rock and Roll Music, which is great. The other ones really don't sound as if they, the Beatles wanted to be there at all. But at the same time, the Beatles' own songwriting, this is the moment when it starts to progress. You get John's I'm a Loser, where he's obviously been listening to Bob Dylan for the first time. He's got the harmonica on there, and he is writing in a very sort of open and rather crass way about his own feelings. And some of the other songs as well, things that people have forgotten, Every Little Thing, What You're Doing, they're not famous songs, but they're almost the epitome of that sort of beat sound. They take the beat sound of 64 as far as it can go. And I think with that record, the Beatles realised they had to find a new direction after that, or they were going to be going downhill.
As opposed to their earlier albums, the songs were a little bit uneven.
It's actually the last one I ever bought, because I didn't know anything on it, except 8 Days a Week, and having got hold of it, I've never listened to it again.
I think it's a marvelous album. It's one of my favorites, as a matter of fact. To me, they didn't sound tired at all, no.
But there is a burnt out, tired sort of element that's underlying the whole album. And in fact, you can see on the album cover, the photographer Robert Freeman took the shot, and they look tired. There's a sort of glazed look in their eye as opposed to this sort of kind of impish, springy look that they usually get,
I don't think it was a tired record. It was like, to me, I think what we do in this day and age when we write albums, we do the first album, then we think the next album must be different.
They weren't as happy. That's the other thing. They were a little more kind of down, where their earlier albums were upbeat.
All of a sudden we're seeing songs where the Beatles aren't just talking about something, they're actually talking about experiences that they had or inner feelings. Lennon's often talked about songs like I'm a Loser or Help as being sort of how he felt at the time or what was going through his head, and writing that down, putting that into a song, very autobiographical. And that was something we weren't seeing 2 albums before that.
8 Days a Week, of course, is a play on words as well. So, the band were probably, working 8 days a week.
I think so, and I'm wondering, 8 days a week, that might have been another Ringoism, maybe. He seemed to be, even though Ringo wasn't writing a lot of songs, he definitely gave John and Paul lots of good ideas for things.
Almost harks back a little bit to their earlier sort of skiffle rock and roll period. Certainly George Harrison's sort of guitar playing sounds a lot like Carl Perkins, one of his heroes, a sort of countrified guitarist.
It starts off very slow, they faded it up. And I think up until that point, there wasn't many rock and roll songs that faded up.
I'd never heard that done before. So just something a little bit different. The Beatles were always looking for different ways to present their music, and that was something totally different.
The texture of the verse changes, and this is something that's going to become much more important for the Beatles subsequently. And I suspect it's George Martin's involvement saying, just change what you're doing there. The harmony's fine, the melody's fine, the lyrics are fine, but let's just change the way it's being played. Is it a description of how hard they're working? Probably like a hard day's night. I've had a hard day's night, which means they've been working day and night, 8 days a week. Yes, they probably feel as though they've been working 8 days a week, but I can't be that analytical. I just put the record on and think, wish I could write a song like that. Unbelievable.
Through 1964, if the Beatles weren't filming or doing TV, they were on the road. And whereas in 62 and 63 that meant playing Liverpool and various cinemas all around Britain, in 64 they went to America, and they went to Australia and New Zealand, and they went all over Europe. They went to America twice, in fact. And so by the end of the year they were exhausted. And so what did they do at the end of the year? They toured Britain, and then they went and played a Beatles Christmas show in London, where it was like a Beatles pantomime, which they really didn't want to do. They had to go to the same theatre 3 weeks running, do really stupid sketches, do jokes that nobody could hear because people were screaming all the way through. And so that was really the end of the sort of Beatlemania era. At the end of 64, they said to Brian Epstein, look, we're happy to carry on touring, but we cannot work at this pace, and we're never doing another Christmas show.
John Lennon in dark glasses, white trousers, blue plimsolls, black socks, lilac shirt, and multicoloured jacket. And it's lovely to see you again, John, after about 3 months.
Great to see you, Derek, in your grey shirt, blue tie, grey trousers of a tweedy thingy, beetle boots and black socks.
They're not beetle boots.
They will be to anybody who's seen you in the States, Derek.
What's the film called, John?
They haven't got a title yet, Derek, so if you can think of one, we'll be pleased to hear from you, Derek.
I tried to help you once with an album cover, but didn't get very far. Have you had any ideas which come close to the title, or they've all been sort of laugh ideas?
They've all been laughs. He who laughs, 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 laughs. Things like that.
I think George had one which was something to do with Goldilocks.
Who's been sleeping in my porridge?
That sounds pretty close. Do you think you might use that one?
No, because we can't very well sing about who's been sleeping in my porridge, can we?
And will the title also be the title of a song, do you think?
It'll have to be.
Will it?
That's what I've heard.
How many songs have you written for the film, John?
We're all 13, we've recorded 11, they're using 7, and we need a title song, so altogether we'll have written 14, but only 7 will be in.
The script, which I had a look at this morning, looks a little eccentric. The aim of the operation, presumably, is to get a different sort of film from Hard Day's Night.
Yeah, and we've done it, haven't we?
John Lennon in dark glasses, white trousers, blue plimsolls, black socks, lilac shirt, and multicoloured jacket. And it's lovely to see you again, John, after about 3 months.
Great to see you, Derek, in your grey shirt, blue tie, grey trousers of a tweedy thingy, beetle boots and black socks.
They're not beetle boots.
They will be to anybody who's seen you in the States, Derek.
What's the film called, John?
They haven't got a title yet, Derek, so if you can think of one, we'll be pleased to hear from you, Derek.
I tried to help you once with an album cover, but didn't get very far. Have you had any ideas which come close to the title, or they've all been sort of laugh ideas?
They've all been laughs. He who laughs, 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 laughs. Things like that.
I think George had one which was something to do with Goldilocks.
Who's been sleeping in my porridge?
That sounds pretty close. Do you think you might use that one?
No, because we can't very well sing about who's been sleeping in my porridge, can we?
And will the title also be the title of a song, do you think?
It'll have to be.
Will it?
That's what I've heard.
How many songs have you written for the film, John?
We're all 13, we've recorded 11, they're using 7, and we need a title song, so altogether we'll have written 14, but only 7 will be in.
The script, which I had a look at this morning, looks a little eccentric. The aim of the operation, presumably, is to get a different sort of film from Hard Day's Night.
Yeah, and we've done it, haven't we?
If there's ever a moment when the Beatles were being professional songsmiths, it's the Help album. Now, in retrospect, John Lennon always used to say that the song Help was his great cry from the heart, and I was screaming out for help, but nobody could hear me. But I think that was something that was an inference he added to the song later. I don't think anybody, I'm sure the rest of the members of the band didn't realise that in '65.
Help was the end of a chapter of the Beatles' career. It was like, although probably unknowing to them, had closed the chapter on the first part of their career.
Help came at the end of pretty much 2 years of solid touring for the Beatles, and as the title would suggest, John Lennon was quite keen that somebody stopped the merry-go-round and let him off.
They've had this success for a few years, and I think a lot of it was getting to them. They couldn't go anywhere without being seen and bothered and disturbed. So I think it was a true cry for help, and I think a lot of the innocence of the band and the music was coming to an end at that stage of their career.
Help, I think, definitely was an album that was the last album where you had rockers like Dizzy Miss Lizzy. They had more years of experience as songwriters behind them. They had a bit more time now to experiment more in the studio.
They became quite powerful within the record company because they were selling lots of records, and they could do a little bit more of what they wanted to do. And consequently, what they'd been up to in their private life was then coming out in the making of the records.
Now the Help album has also got Yesterday on, which is the most covered song in history still, I think, and probably will be forever. An immaculate piece of songwriting. I've no idea where it came from. Paul McCartney has no idea where it came from. Various people have tried to find the melody in old songs by Nat King Cole or old bits of classical music. But as far as Paul was concerned, he just woke up one morning and had that tune, and he spent about 18 months then going around to everybody he met saying, "Have you heard this tune before? It must be somebody else's." And they'd go, "No." "Oh, okay." And then he ended up with the song.
But Yesterday is certainly one of the most, if not the most, celebrated of all the Beatles songs.
Well, I think that was kind of a kind of crucial moment in the Beatles' career, really, where people realised that they were not just the four mop tops, they really were masterful songwriters.
And of course it attracted a whole other area of audience, a lot of other people who might not have listened to a Beatles record suddenly thought, "Oh, that's nice, that's different."
Even though it can be considered sort of a middle-of-the-road song, it was covered by so many different people, you know, it really was a hallmark song for the Beatles because they were a rock and roll band, and here was a rock and roll song using a string quartet in it.
The reason everyone fawned over Yesterday is because it's the first time they used strings. Simple. It's the first time an orchestra started on, and they started to expand their musical ideas, and that's why everyone goes for it. The Beatles have written a ballad. Basically, that's because people haven't listened to the other albums, because there's a few in there.
This is the first song of the Beatles where I feel the words have been really worked at. He's brought them together in a perfect marriage. It's a terrific song.
But the rest of the Help album was very much sort of Beatles by numbers. They were, by this point, they knew how to write a Beatles pop song, and they could do it in their sleep, and most of Help sounds as if they did do it in their sleep.
I think this was a groundbreaking album in a lot of ways because this is when, I would say, more or less, all ties were severed with the Mersey sound.
Rubber Soul, the second Beatles fully written album.
By the time Rubber Soul came around, most of their recording sessions would start at like 9 or 10 o'clock at night and go to 4 or 5 in the morning. This was basically because of their lifestyle and the fact that they had a bit more carte blanche to do a lot more different things in Abbey Road.
More than ever before, they started recording their music just using single tracks rather than playing so much live in the studio as they did when they first started out.
George Martin, great musician, started to help them arrange, started to put strings, started to put brass on things, started to help them.
He would say, "Well, chaps, you know, we've got an oboe makes an interesting sound there, or a flugelhorn, or, you know," and they'd say, "Well, let's hear it, George, can we get it?" And he would get the classical musicians in to play it, and they'd say, "That's great," you know. So here was a very different approach to recording.
They didn't see any reason for changing keys at the wrong time. They didn't see any reason for not doing this. They just saw no reason for not doing anything like that. So when it came to Rubber Soul, they kicked in big time. That was the first of 5 classic records to be made.
Once the Beatles knew that they'd got the public ear and that they didn't have to fight to be heard, the music became more interesting, the songs became more interesting. Perhaps it was the lyrics that really became more interesting because Lennon and McCartney started putting their own problems into song.
You see the Beatles not trying to write a love song or trying to write something for a specific group. They really wanted to broaden their scope and to write songs that were either based on life experiences or on how the way they felt about things.
Lennon and McCartney are seeing the possibilities of the popular song as an expressive form rather than simply as a set of procedures, a set of formulae that had been handed down.
I think a lot of songs at that stage, they were taking their time and they were looking inside and asking, is this really what it's all about?
There were young guys growing up in this madness, and they'd seen everything. They'd done it all, they'd seen it all, they'd probably taken it all, God knows.
Well, I think At some point they must have had some tea. Lots of it, and biscuits. No, I don't know. It's difficult because, I mean, their fans put them in that position where they couldn't go anywhere. I mean, when they used to come and see us, they had to put my false moustaches on and sort of dark glasses. And it's like, Inspector Clouseau, what's going on? And so they were screamed off the road, and so they went into the studio, and when they got all these toys, and they had all the time in the world to sort of, and money in the world to sort of experiment with it.
1965 was the year the Beatles discovered drugs, mind-expanding drugs in a big way. They spent most of that year listening to Bob Dylan under the influence of mind-expanding drugs, and they hung out with him in London, and they met people like the beat poet Allen Ginsberg. And so, all in all, they started to think we should be doing more with our songwriting than we are at the moment. And the results of that are on Rubber Soul, where you actually get them trying to stand outside themselves and then look back at their own experience in a self-consciously artistic way for the first time. They weren't just writing pop songs, they were writing songs for themselves, about themselves. And in popular music terms, in pop terms, I don't think that had really been done before. OK, Bob Dylan had done Highway 61 and bringing it all back home by that point. But he was a folk artist who'd become a rock artist. The Beatles were still trying to be a pop band at that point. And so it was a very brave sort of tightrope walk that they were taking, trying to bring all their new artistic influences into the mainstream pop business.
There was a period of time, I can't think how long it was, but it was some time, in between the previous album to Rubber Soul and the start of Rubber Soul. What had happened in that time, I don't know. They had changed, so much so that when, you see, up to the previous album before Rubber Soul, we were like a happy family, the six of us. It was that tight. It was so enjoyable up to that time, everything. I mean, George Martin used to call himself the fifth Beatle. Well, I argued with him on that when I did interviews. He wasn't. He said I was the sixth, but I used to reverse it. I was the fifth, he was the sixth. Anyhow, that's the sort of relationship we had. It was lovely, you know. Up until they came in and started Rubber Soul. And I noticed a distinct change, which I did not like one little bit. Personality change, particularly between Paul and John. And they looked different in any case. I think they were their beards and whatever. And they looked completely different, and they acted so different. And the nice family life had gone. And now it was this, well, I didn't like it. They were bickering, they were taking much longer to do tracks, arguing about what they should do. There was that distinctive, I wouldn't say dislike, but it was the start of dislike growing, which upset me terribly. And it was, fortunately, I say fortunately, because I was able, if I wished, to get out of it. Simply because the offer of becoming a producer came about soon after we started Rubber Soul. And I thought to myself, what good timing for me now to get out, because I don't like what's going on. So I said to Epstein and George Martin, I can't stand this, you know, I've got the offer of taking over Parlophone, becoming a producer myself. So I want out. So of course, I mean, that caused great disappointment and upset amongst the boys. And well, what they did to soften me up, I suppose, I don't know, they were that upset. They went out to Asprey's in New Bond Street and they bought me a gold clock, a carriage clock, inscribed it to me from them. I've still got it, of course, all locked away naturally. And I thought, well, you know, it almost brought me to tears that they would do that, what they thought of me. Would I please continue and finish the album, Rubber Soul, which I agreed to do. And but after that I said, you know, that I can't continue anymore, because simply I've got now to get on with my new job as producer. So it was a mixture, really, for me, in terms of enjoyment. Enjoyment of the sounds that I produced, yes, in Rubber Soul, quite impressive, but disappointment and upset in terms of the relationships. And I could foresee, quite honestly. It was the beginning of the breakup, of the end of the group.
Well, the Bonzos were in Abbey Road Studios recording My Brother Makes the Noises for the Talkies, and which is a very, very silly song. And it required obviously a lot of sound effects. And while the guys were figuring out what a razor scraping noise would be, or a steam scraping, I went down the corridor to the gents, and it was on my way back, and the layout of the building is such that you come back up the main corridor and you're facing the front door. And there in the front door, silhouetted from the sunlight outside, were four guys with very distinctive haircuts and pointy shoes and dark glasses and, two big minders. And I thought, of course, it's them, it's the Fabs. And so I snuck out the corridor later on to see what they were up to. In fact, they were working on one of George's songs, and it was funny because I was telling him about this, years later. And he immediately remembered the riff, this wonderful riff. I want to tell you, I feel hung up and I don't know why. I know they're not the right words, but this piano going... probably one of the most exciting things I'd heard at the time. It's quite bizarre because then I had to go back into our studio and finish off My Brother Makes the Noises for the Talkies. And a wide range of music available there in 1966.
Up until 1966, every time George Harrison came up with a song, everybody laughed at him. Particularly George Martin, the Beatles producer, who would always sort of pat him on the back patronisingly and say, well, it's not bad, but go away and do something better. And I think John and Paul were also very, very cynical about their younger brother, as they would have seen him, because don't forget he's 3 years younger than John Lennon. Very cynical about the idea that he suddenly wanted to be a songwriter as well. In fact, in 65, he had already started to write interesting, unusual songs, and he had a very sort of cynical, open-eyed, realistic take on romance as well. And that came through in 66 with the three great songs he wrote for Revolver. Where he really started to exert his influence on the band. Then the most important way in which he changed the Beatles' songwriting was by introducing the Indian influence. Not quite the first time it had been done on a pop record. The Yardbirds and maybe the Kinks had got there first. But as far as the outside world was concerned, he was the one who was leading the world into sort of Oriental mysticism and the whole sound of the sitar and the tabla and so on. And in 66, for something like Love You Too, George Harrison's Indian song, to turn up on the Revolver album, I think it opened people's eyes amazingly, and I think people couldn't really believe what they were hearing.
I think George was very underestimated and had tremendous talent, and unfortunately, because John and Paul, historically, I think you've got to put this into context. John had started the band. Paul had joined the band later but became very much an integral part of it. And George, it mightn't seem a lot, but I think when you are 19, 20 and somebody's only 16, they're the little kid. And George had joined the band even younger than that, when he was about 14 years of age, and John was very reluctant to take him on because of his age. And I think in John and Paul's eyes, he was always seen as the little kid. Now, consequently, he didn't have the greatest singing voice, George, but he could write material and was a very, very talented man, but he would only get the statutory sort of obligatory 2 tracks if he was lucky on an album. Now, the interesting thing is that when the Beatles disbanded, George really, I think, came into his own with his own work, right through to the end of his life, the stuff he was doing. But when he was with the Beatles, I do think he was seen as sort of the young one.
It's quite striking that the first song on Revolver is a George Harrison song, Taxman. And okay, John, you always used to claim he wrote half of it, and George should have given him the credit. But it is very much George. It's about money. It's about worrying about what was going to happen to him as a person if all the money ran out. Because the Beatles were paying, I think it was 98% of their income at that point to the inland revenue. And so, not surprisingly, it was a very major preoccupation, particularly for George, who already had the reputation of being the one member of the Beatles who was interested in the business affairs. But for the youngest member of the band and the one who had been treated as a joke to suddenly have the lead track on the album was quite a breakthrough for George, I think.
Okay.
Yellow Submarine was written by Paul. It was all about a dream that he had had. And the whole idea of it, he always thought it was, you know, kind of a children's song.
Again, it was written specifically for Ringo to sing it, and so the vocal range is very narrow, and they would deliberately do that when they wrote for Ringo.
George Martin helped out. He had a closet, he showed the Beatles, full of all kinds of different weird instruments they could use, and they used tons of sound effects. It was just a time for them to have a lot of fun in the studio.
That was one of the joys of the Beatles, was that they could be a group for all seasons and appeal to so many different, social groups. It wasn't just a band producing clever music for the Times critics to mull over. They would come up with these daft little ditties now and then, and that was certainly a daft little ditty.
So if you look at the album as a whole, they take a number of different approaches and are opening wide the possibilities of what a popular song can take on in terms of subject matter. Yellow Submarine is simply one of those.
It goes on an album that's packed with classics. I mean, Revolver, nearly the best album they ever made. Maybe the best album they ever made. Eleanor Rigby, Here, There and Everywhere, She Said, I'm Only Sleeping. I mean, that album has 14 classics on it.
Do you consider that now, since you've been in the United States here for almost a week, that this religious issue is answered once and for all? Would you clarify and repeat the answer that you gave in Chicago?
I can't repeat it again because I don't know what I said, you know.
The most traumatic occasion, from my point of view, in the 6 years that I was with the Beatles as their PR, concerned, again, John and his outspoken interview with the London Evening Standard's Maureen Cleave, who, as part of a series of in-depth profiles of each of the Beatles for the Standard, spoke in depth to John. And John, at one point in the conversation, talking generally about religion and social circumstances of the era, made the remark, the Beatles are more popular than Jesus now. He didn't say bigger. An awful lot of people have misquoted that, him saying in a boastful kind of a way, we're bigger than Jesus now. He didn't say that. He said we are more popular, and by this he meant that more people were going down to the local Empire theatres or the ABC cinemas to see concerts by the Beatles than were going to their local church or chapel or whatever to worship God, worship Jesus Christ. And it wasn't so much a boast at all as very valid social comment. Buried way down in the Evening Standard article, it raised no eyebrows at all, but I guess silent nods of approval amongst the readership. Certainly it didn't startle me as the group's PR in any way. It didn't worry me greatly. And in fact, I've never talked about this before, but I can say that I was actually directly instrumental in helping to get that story reproduced in America, which became the cause of a massive furor where Beatles albums were burned. There was a threat that the whole of the tour that year of America would be called off because of the Ku Klux Klan, and all kinds of threats, death threats were coming from, particularly from the religious zealots in the deep south, the southern states of America. And I was directly concerned in that in the pre-tour months, when the Beatles were extremely busy and doing lots of other things, I was unable to get them as much as I would like to have got them for interview time with American journalists for American magazines. But I appreciated that the build-up in America was crucial to this massive tour that we were about to undertake. And when the publisher of Datebook magazine, a guy named Art Unger, when he came on to me and said was a chance he could do some interviews with the Beatles, I said, no, it's just going to be impossible at the moment, Art, to meet your deadlines, but what I can do is put you on to Maureen Cleave at the London Evening Standard. She just did a series of superb, in-depth profiles of the Beatles, which I think would sit well in Datebook magazine. and he negotiated to get hold of that material.
Well, would you clarify the remarks that were attributed to you?
You tell me what you think I meant, and I'll tell you whether I agree or...
Well, some of the remarks attributed to you in some of the newspapers, the press here, said that concerning the remark that you made comparing the relative popularity of the Beatles with Jesus Christ, and that the Beatles were more popular. This created quite a controversy and a furor in this country, as you are obviously aware.
Do you know that, John? You created it.
Now, would you clarify the remark?
Well, I've clarified it about 800 times, you know. I could have said TV or something else, you know, and that's as clear as it can be. I just used Beatles because I know about them a bit more than TV. I could have said any number of things.
I remember seeing John Lennon beforehand. It was my job to kind of prepare him for this very unusually serious press conference which we were holding on the eve of the tour in Chicago, at which the world's press would be represented, and they were there for one purpose, not for a light-hearted show business style party come press conference at all, but a very serious interrogation type press conference where they would be all sort of saying, John, you've got to apologise, you've insulted the church, etc. And I remember sitting in Brian Epstein's hotel suite with John, and John was saying, I will say whatever you tell me I should be saying. I'll say what I don't feel I have to apologise, should apologise. I've said nothing blasphemous or intentionally blasphemous, but I will say whatever you want me to say. And at one point during our conversation, John was sitting there most uncharacteristically with his head actually cupped it down in his hands, and he was sobbing. He was weeping away, not at the prospect of the press conference itself so much as the fact that he realised that if he didn't get it all right, that the tour might be cancelled, he might be letting down the group.
This is one of the reasons, this is cited as one of the reasons why they stopped touring. Apart from the boredom of it as well, you know, they were cooped up in hotel rooms and, you know, they couldn't get out of theatres and walk around like they used to do, like the Paul McCartney as I knew walking down Matthew Street. That's had all gone. And John Lennon in particular didn't like the fact that you couldn't hear them. You know, all you could hear was this din of screaming.
For a lot of people, Beatlemania was for life. I mean, even now in every major city across the globe, people have Beatle festivals regularly. And, you know, and the Beatles are acquiring new fans all the time with every successive generation. But I think that it was starting to ease up a bit by about 1965, 1966. For example, when they toured the States, I mean, it wasn't always guaranteed that, you know, that the stadium would be full anymore. There was very much an attitude of, you know, it was like London buses. If you miss one Beatle concert, there'd be another along if you waited long enough. But at the same time, I mean, I think that touring was becoming almost, well, very definitely dangerous at the time. It was certainly very tedious for them.
I saw the Beatles twice at Hammersmith Odeon on their Christmas shows. You couldn't hear anything. The noise was mental. The girls were wetting themselves. It was all getting silly.
Got to remember, back in those days, guitar amplifiers were 30 watt. You didn't really have the amplification systems that you have now. You didn't even have the amplifications you would have at the end of the 60s. So really, when it came to playing live, the Beatles were always onto a loser.
In a lot of cases, they had to just kind of wing it and hope that they were all playing together. When you listen to the old tape recordings of these performances, they did pretty darn good, you know, considering they couldn't hear themselves.
It was an event. You know, musically maybe they probably couldn't even hear the Beatles. I mean, the Beatles couldn't even hear themselves play. So, I mean, you went there to be there kind of thing. I think that was the whole idea with the Beatles concerts at that time.
So, you know, what are your criteria for a great live band? If the criterion is, well, somebody who can whip up a hell of a lot of enthusiasm, well, they didn't even have to play a note in order to do that. So, yes, they were a great live band, but were they great musicians on stage? Possibly not.
They were a very good band, but they were never given the chance to be a good band once they became really popular, because you could just hear nothing but screaming. I only saw them when everyone was going mental and potty, and it was a great privilege to say I've seen the Beatles, but I didn't actually hear them.
The Beatles played rock and roll very well, and they also came up with all these extraordinary original songs which didn't talk down to people. I think that's the important thing. That's why the Beatles struck a chord with so many people, not just teenage girls screaming at John and Paul, but the whole adult world as well loved the Beatles very quickly.
I'm afraid I'm in the school that thinks that Sgt. Pepper's one of the most overrated albums in rock history. Individual songs, I think some of them are wonderful. I mean, You Can't Fault a Day in the Life. Desperately trying to scrabble to think of what the other really good songs are. I think the ones that have stood up best over 40 years are maybe the ones that people don't really remember, like the Paul McCartney songs Fixing a Hole and It's Getting Better, which are very concise, tight bits of sort of pop rock songwriting. But the stuff that where they're self-consciously trying to do something new and, you know, make a play or a movie or a musical out of it, with songs like the Sgt. Pepper song itself, and also Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, I don't think they've dated very well at all. They're very much of their time.
I think that Sgt. Pepper was just a little bit self-indulgent, a bit over the top, a bit over-waxed, overcooked. No, I prefer my Beatles music much more raw than that, if you like. And so mainly I prefer the earliest stuff that they wrote. Although there was an amateurishness about it, Sgt. Pepper was too contrived, and it was natural that it should go that direction, because after they came off the road, all eyes were upon this first product of their studio era, and the Beatles were producing something not just for their thousands, millions of fans, but something, I guess, that they felt would be professionally strong enough to impress their own peers, i.e. the Rolling Stones, the Beach Boys, etc.
One wonders what would have happened if they'd had the same kind of gear we've got now, you know. Because Sgt. Pepper, I think, was recorded on four-track machines. And it's because of them, you know, 24-track machines revolved, you know.
When the Beatles started out, George Martin was the boss. He had a tie and he wore a suit, and they did what he told them to do. Very early on, he started to realise that there was actually some mileage in letting them, you know, off the reins for a bit and let them indulge their ideas. But he would still very much be there to say, I don't think that's going to work, boys. By the time you get to Sgt. Pepper, I think that relationship has entirely changed, and George Martin's role is not anymore to direct them, it's to enable them to carry out the ideas that they want. And so they would come to him and say, can we make a sound that sounds like monks chanting or an orchestra playing backwards? And he would then settle down and go, right, I think if we do this and we do that, we can actually achieve it. And the result was that then after that, John and Paul would come in with even more outlandish ideas, and poor George Martin would be forced to, and his staff would be forced to innovate, and you know, that actually had quite a big influence on the development of the recording studio in the late 60s. The fact that the Beatles engineers were being forced to come up with unusual sounds to keep the group happy actually helped the engineers to create all sorts of innovations that are still being used today.
Sgt. Pepper, fated as the Beatles' true masterpiece, I put it down to one thing and one thing only. The Times gave it a great review. Stamp of approval. For me, bit of a smokescreen.
If you're hip, then Sgt. Pepper is not the greatest Beatles album, it's Revolver. If you're not, and I guess I'm not, then Sgt. Pepper is the sort of, I suppose, the pinnacle.
It's not something that the Beatles themselves had tried before, the mixture of different images, sounds, styles. It really does stand as a one of a kind.
The packaging was unbelievably clever. You know, it came at you, it had the whole psychedelic swinging 60s thing about it. It just came at you, them in uniforms, the whole lot. It was just unbelievably perfect.
You had the lyrics on the sleeve. You know, this is really the first signal that, hey, when you're listening to this stuff, you should listen to the lyrics, as well as just the groove and the melody.
It was definitely a real departure. It sort of set the standard for other bands to try to come up to the same standards as what the Beatles were doing at that time. And it only came about because the Beatles, I believe, had more free time in their hands and they weren't touring anymore.
I thought that they hadn't really finished what they set out to do, which was to write one big piece of music. I mean, it's full of marvellous things, like, you know, but they don't really link together. I think it was supposed to be a concept album, but I mean, When I'm 64 and Day in the Life don't really link thematically.
As a concept record, which had never been made before, yes, it was brilliant. Rubber Soul and Revolver, I think, in some ways are probably stronger records, but if you say what was their masterpiece, I would have to say it would be Sgt. Pepper's, because it also captured the era.
It's a work of exploration and experimentation. It could have sort of fallen flat in its face. Commercially speaking, I think the world was shocked by the release of Sgt. Pepper's, but within months, I think the world loved Sgt. Pepper's, and it was being hailed as a masterpiece way back then.
Riding on the coattails of Sgt. Pepper's album, it seemed the Beatles could do no wrong.
The Beatles were very much affected by Brian Epstein's death, and they really didn't want to be managed in full by anybody else. As I say, they turned down one person in particular. Who can tell really what would have happened if he'd lived?
Yeah, it wasn't until the Beatles physically stopped touring that there was any sort of breakdown in relations with Brian. It was just that it suddenly dawned that they didn't actually need a manager if their record contracts and all those things were already set up and done, and they weren't going anywhere or doing anything. So what was the manager and an agency going to do for them?
I suppose the last job, gig, production, whatever, that I saw the Beatles do enthusiastically as a group, as a team together, working solidly together with mutual enthusiasm, must have been the making of Magical Mystery Tour towards the back end of 1967, immediately after Brian Epstein's death, in fact. Now, a lot of people at the time thought that Paul McCartney was being very callous in forcing the group to go back to work within a few days of Brian Epstein's death and a few days of his funeral. But in fact, if Paul had not pushed them into working at that time, I believe that they might well have gone off to India with their newfound little giggling guru, the Mahesh Yogi, with whom they wanted to study transcendental meditation. George in particular had got the bug.
Mystery Tour was like a hangover after Brian had died, plus hangover after Sgt. Pepper, and you know, those songs were nearly all written pre-Sgt. Pepper and weren't used. And Your Mother Should Know was a song Paul wrote as a possibility for With All You Need Is Love for the satellite thing. And of course, All You Need Is Love won the vote on that one. So he had that, and George had his songs, and John had written, I think Walrus was written during, but not done during the Pepper sessions. And then Paul had this idea, let's go on a Magical Mystery Tour. And they needed to do something to recover from Brian's disappearance. And the thing with the NEMS people was just unbearable. There were all those people who instead of holding NEMS together as what it was, huge, big, all they were blathering about was who's going to manage the Beatles. You know, there's sort of these agents and people and men in suits who worked there. They couldn't. They never saw. Within months, NEMS had just gone into nowhere. You know, the Bee Gees and Jimmy and the Who and the Cream and all those good people had all left because they were. So the Beatles just wanted to get something, and particularly Paul wanted to get something done. So they just went off and did Magical Mystery Tour.
There's another way that you can look at Magical Mystery Tour coming as it did in the immediate wake of Brian Epstein's death. It was a shattering experience for the Beatles because whilst on the one hand they had found him to be a much less effective, influential or necessary manager in the last years of his life, they did value his friendship and remembered all the things that he had done for them. And all four Beatles were very, very upset indeed by his death. You can look at Magical Mystery Tour coming only a week or so after his death as being escapist. It was the Beatles' essential escape route, if you like, from the horrors of the fact that somebody so close to them as Brian Epstein, so young, of their generation in fact, had died in front of their eyes almost, as it were, like this. You could see Magical Mystery Tour as, yeah, something where they were going to go into a magical world. It was a world of magic and mystery, and it literally transported, it took them away in a bus down to the West Country, so that they were so busy messing about in the bus that they didn't have time to be as mournful as they might well have been in such serious circumstances.
Everything they'd done from their first hit up till then had received everybody's praise. Magical Mystery Tour basically was the first false step where the public and all the critics could have a bit of a go at them.
When it was shown on television in black and white at Christmas time that year, it didn't go down terribly well. The public were confused by it. The critics didn't like it. So it was like the first bad reviews the Beatles had ever really experienced. It was quite a bit of a blow for them.
And the Beatles were so worried, in fact, that they had it shown again in colour about 2 weeks later. But strange enough, the damage had been done.
A lot of people said, well, it would never have happened with Brian Epstein. When Brian Epstein was alive, he wouldn't have allowed it because it was too obscure, it wasn't direct enough, etc., etc.
They'd just thrown all these elements together, got in a bus and driven around and filmed what happened.
And it never really came across as this happy Magical Mystery Tour that it was supposed to be. It came across as a bit of a mess.
People loved it. You know, the proper Beatle people loved it. It was just the critics at the time. But then, you know, the Beatles no longer had that protective wall of Brian around them. You know, they were open for, it was open season on them by then. They never quite recaptured that belief that the media had in them after that. They were pretty unsinkable up until Mystery Tour, and I think the critics needed something to give them a bit of their own.
Considered that for 6 years I had been part of the greatest phenomenon of the show business world in working at such close quarters and within the inner circle of the Beatles. So of course, when that era came to an end, there was sadness about it, but I also recognised that I had been part of the whole Beatles situation, the Beatlemania situation, and that was no longer around. The era had gone. The Beatles were no longer the Fab Four. They were individual people. There was Paul McCartney, John Lennon, Ringo Starr, George Harrison, going out to do their separate things, and therefore there was no sadness in the fact that all that was over, because that had done everything that it could do as a unit, as a band. It had been a memorable part of history, but I was ready to move on just as much as they were.
Okay, While My Guitar Gently Weeps starts in C minor, and And then he keeps the C minor chord, but he puts a B flat root on it. And then he keeps the C minor chord and he puts an A root on it. And then it actually changes to an A flat major 7th chord. And then he plays a C minor chord, a B flat major chord, an F major to a G major. And then he repeats the whole process. Except this time he goes C minor to B flat to E flat major to G major, and it brings him to the chorus of C. So it's a beautifully constructed piece of music there.
I think the White Album might be the greatest rock album of all time. Not necessarily my favourite, but I can't think of anything else that has so many different styles, so much pizzazz, so much innovation, so much intelligence, so much fun, so much pain, so much pleasure, all across 30 songs, 90 minutes of music. And okay, at the time George Martin said he wished that he could have compressed the record and made one great album out of it. But I think it actually works better as a sprawling monster of a record with 30 songs. And often the ones that stick in the mind are the throwaways, they're the 1-minute songs. Why don't you do it in the road? Or Wild Honey Pie, stupid little things that shouldn't work, but which are still great fun to play 40 years later.
Abbey Road is an unbelievable piece of work. Absolutely, probably close to their best piece of work they've ever made.
Everybody talks about the great medley of songs on the second side, and it's entirely meaningless and it's wonderful pop music. I mean, it's the absolute high point of 60s pop production, and ELO made an entire career out of trying to reproduce it through the 70s and 80s. It's the last time when John and Paul actually worked together. I mean, John always was very sarcastic about that medley in retrospect. If you go back to the newspaper cuttings, it reveals it was actually as much John's idea in the first place as it was Paul's. John was equally enthusiastic about it. And it suited him later when he was writing very personal songs to pretend that, oh no, I don't know, I was forced into doing that kind of thing. At the same time, you've got George Harrison's real emergence as a world-class songwriter. Frank Sinatra said that Something was the greatest love song ever written. Now, after that, he always used to credit it to Lennon and McCartney, which was a bit of a shame, but you know, it was a nice thought. And it is one of the great ballads, I mean, by anybody, never mind a Beatle. And at the same time, George also wrote Here Comes the Sun on a day when he had a business meeting and he got really fed up and he'd gone back and sat in Eric Clapton's garden and got his acoustic guitar out and thought, I'm not going to get caught in all that Beatles nonsense. I'm just, you know, it's sunny, it's lovely, and an amazing song came out of it.
I think by the time Abbey Road came out, the Beatles were really looking into sort of what they were going to do when they finished as a band.
The end was in sight for the Beatles, and so although I still wouldn't say they'd run out of steam as writers, perhaps it was becoming slightly evident that it was more of a chore, really. It was lesser kind of inspiration.
They left the best epitaph to a band they could ever leave. That was probably one of their best records ever, and it was phenomenal.
If you're looking at the times of recording, the final Beatles album was really Abbey Road, but Let It Be emerged after Abbey Road as the final release. Obviously that meant that people considered that the Beatles' career ended with Let It Be, and the band themselves weren't happy with that.
The last thing, which, you know, could have been, you know, thanks very much everybody, you know, it's been fun, but we're not going to do it anymore. It ended up being a really bitter and nasty divorce.
It would have been far better, in fact, had Abbey Road been the final released Beatles album, but fate decreed that it wouldn't be.
But even at the end, the Beatles were still making great records and still producing thoughtful pieces of music, timeless pieces of music.
And it's quite a sad end to what was an absolutely fantastic career.
You felt sorry for those poor kids who worked there, and all those fans. You know, just like, what are they going to do? It was just a big sort of, what, the fan club, there's millions of them. You know, they're going to be so upset. And of course they were. But but that's what happens when people get divorced. You know, there's always people let down in the end.
The whole point of Let It Be was it was supposed to be the Beatles live. They were going to do a concert, then they didn't want to do a concert. That was too much effort, and they didn't like the fans anymore anyway, and they couldn't be asked. So they'd make a record pretending to be live, and that's why they went up onto the Apple roof and so on. But the concept got flawed as soon as they started overdubbing and adding things and so on, and then it got flawed even more when Phil Spector came in a year later and added orchestras and girl harmony choirs and so on to it. So what was supposed to be a live record of what the Beatles really did sound like, as John Lennon said, with our trousers down, got perverted as a concept. Now the other main problem with Let It Be is that John Lennon was on heroin at the time, and so his creative input was virtually nil. If you listen back to the recording tapes for the sessions, the number of times you can hear Paul McCartney saying to John, have you got anything? Have you got anything to offer? And John just doesn't say anything. Yoko answers on his behalf. Or George will come up with a new song. I mean, George was coming in with a good new song almost every day at that point, and he'd play it to John, who'd just go, oh, that's boring, and start playing an old 12-bar blues song instead. So when you've got the person who has been effectively the leader of the group saying, I don't care anymore, I'd rather take drugs than play music with you, it's very hard to get a cohesive album out of that situation.
I think the Beatles broke a mould that said that pop music is of its time, because for Beatles fans and for pop fans, Beatles music is forever.
They could rock with the best of them, but they could do a ballad as sweet as anybody.
Even if they were playing rock and roll, it's very balanced and tasteful. That's the trick, I think, that they achieved, really.
They gave a whole generation a meaning, and they gave the whole music industry its start.
The world needed something different, and they came around at the right time.
So if you think about it in modern day context, how long does a band last? 2 or 3 years? Well, the Beatles did a bit better than that and produced an incredible amount of music.
What's the one?
Most unusual request we've ever had from a
Well, I wouldn't like to say.